Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. This session focuses on the English speech community and virtual networks. I hope and expect by the end of this session you would be able to understand the interconnection. Well, my dear students, at the very outset of the session, the question that emerges is, can we define the English speech community simply as the people who speak English? In this case, what we need to consider is English is a lingua franca in today's world. It has a spread all over the globe. So its situation is different from many other languages that are spoken by different communities, that are spoken by different groups of people, by different societies, or for that matter, by people in different state nations. So, when we think of this idea of speaking, of being members of this English speech community, and everybody who speaks English is a member of that community, if we buy this idea, at first sight, it would not seem problematic. It is okay when, a speech community is defined by, a particular language that is being used by those speakers. This can be applied to English as well. However, the case is not that simple. And to help you understand how it is not that simple, I would give you the example of a farmer community. In a farming community or in a farmer's community, who would be the members of this farming community? A group of people who have farming as common amongst them. Now, we are not interested in other features of this community, such as their interest in rock music, their interest in a particular kind of food, their interest in particular kind of activities, or their physical features. For example, their sharing the same color of their eyes, etc. We are not concerned with any of these things. We are only concerned with one feature that brings them together as a community is that is farming, and on the basis of that they can be called a community of farmers or a farming community. If we draw now an analogy, we make a comparison and we think of English speech community, well, the people in the English speech community, they all share some kind of linguistic knowledge, of English language. Well, there is a problem with this idea. It is hard to agree on what kind of knowledge of English these people actually have. Because in this case, first we need to draw a boundary for English itself. Like in the case of previous example, we could define farming. So we need to define English in purely linguistic sense to resolve the problem. We use more than just language because when it comes to expressing in some language, we use something more than language. We get ourselves identified as human beings in particular groups in so many different ways. For example, as members of a community, it is our clothing, it is our conduct, etc. that makes us the members of that community. Now, when we return back to this example of the farming community, I would raise another question. When we were defining this community of farmers, for example, are we going to include all those people who are the owners of these farms only? Or are we going to include all the people who do farming, which means who are either the owners of the farms or who work on these farms? Now, this complicates the situation. Because in this case, we have already added variables. We are not focusing only on farming. We have added conditions to this situation. Ownership as another variable is added to that. Now think of English language and think of, those who own English language and those who only use it. So, there are problems related to that. And to add further to this complication, I would also like you to think about the virtual networks. Virtually the whole world, how it is connected through English language. People in different parts of the world, they are using English. I hope you understand what are these networks, how, these social networks are created, within the communities and outside communities through this virtual existence. People have certain strong and weak networks. People through social media connect to other people. So, for example, using English language, people from Pakistan would connect to Australian people, to Indian people, to African people, to French people, etc. And whereas English would be the common, medium of expression in that particular situation, each one of them would bring in a different variety, of English language. So, in that context, when you think of this English community, how would you talk of this community in terms of ownership of language? Because each one of them would bring a different variety that would be different from the standard variety. And again, the issue of whether British English is the standard variety or American English is the standard variety, or the emerging varieties of English, for example, standard Indian or standard Singaporean English, or, for example, standard African English, etc. Are they also eligible to claim for being standard varieties or not? So, all these factors together makes the question or the issue at hand, that is of English speech community in relation to the virtual networks, a very, very complicated one to answer.